I didn't go into the forest looking for trouble. I went there because silence felt safer than my apartment, and being alone felt easier than explaining myself to Daniel Carter, the man I had promised honesty to but no longer knew how to face. The city sat only a few miles behind me, yet the trees swallowed sound so completely that my thoughts began to speak louder than my footsteps. Daniel and I had been together long enough to move in, long enough to learn each other's habits, long enough for love to turn practical. He was dependable, gentle in a way that didn't demand anything back. And that was the problem I couldn't name out loud. I felt invisible beside his steadiness, like a story that had already reached its ending while the pages kept turning. The forest trail was narrow, uneven, and damp from last night's rain. I followed it without direction, telling myself I just needed air, space, a moment that belonged to me alone. Every few steps, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't check it. I already knew it was Daniel, asking where I was, asking if I was okay. I wasn't ready to answer either question. I noticed them only when the path widened into a clearing. Two men stood near the edge of the trees, close enough that I felt their presence before I fully saw them. My first instinct was fear, a sharp, instinctive warning that made my shoulders tense and my breath shorten. I stopped walking. They didn't move. The taller one stepped forward first. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said calmly, his voice steady, almost reassuring. "This trail doesn't get much traffic." His name, I would soon learn, was Lucas Hale. He carried himself with an ease that suggested confidence without arrogance, like someone who knew exactly where he stood in the world. Beside him was Ryan Moore, quieter, his gaze observant rather than curious. He watched me the way someone watches weather, alert, cautious, waiting to see what might change. "I was just passing through," I said, hating how unsure I sounded. "So were we," Lucas replied. "Looks like we all came here to get away from something." That sentence landed harder than it should have. I told myself it was coincidence, but the truth was simpler, he was right. Ryan's eyes flicked toward Lucas briefly, as if measuring his words, then back to me. For a moment, none of us spoke. The forest filled the silence with the low rustle of leaves and distant birds. I realized then that I could walk away. I could nod, apologize, and keep moving. Nothing was stopping me except the strange relief I felt standing there, unseen by anyone who knew my name. "I'm Ethan Brooks," I said finally. Lucas smiled, not wide, not forced. "Good to meet you, Ethan." We talked the way strangers do when there's no pressure to impress. About the trail, about the weather, about how easy it was to get lost out here if you didn't pay attention. Ryan spoke less, but when he did, his words were precise, thoughtful. He asked where I was headed. I shrugged, and for the first time that day, it felt honest. Lucas studied me with an intensity that wasn't invasive, just focused. "You look like someone who needed this place," he said. I laughed quietly. Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to be found. Something shifted then, not in the forest, but in me. The fear I'd felt earlier dissolved into something more complicated. Awareness, curiosity, a sense that this encounter wasn't random, even if logic insisted otherwise. My phone buzzed again. This time, I glanced at the screen. "Daniel." I turned it face down without answering. Ryan noticed. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly, as if he understood more than I'd said. Lucas didn't look at the phone at all. He looked at me. "You don't have to stay," Lucas said, gently. "But you can." The choice was mine. That was the dangerous part. I took a step deeper into the clearing, away from the path I'd planned to follow, and felt something inside me cross an invisible line. Not betrayal yet, not even intent, just the quiet decision not to leave. The forest closed around us again, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. I told myself the forest encounter was a pause, not a turning point. That lie made it easier to return. Over the next few days, I found reasons to walk the same trail at the same hour. I framed it as routine, exercise, reflection, fresh air, but the truth surfaced each time I reached the clearing and felt the anticipation tighten my chest. Lucas Hale was usually there first, leaning against a tree as if he belonged to the place. Ryan Moore arrived later, unhurried, his presence steadying in a way that made the space feel deliberate rather than accidental. We didn't call them meetings. They were conversations that happened to continue. Lucas spoke with an attentiveness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. He asked questions that didn't demand answers but invited them, and when I hesitated, he waited. Ryan listened more than he spoke, but his silence carried weight. When he did offer a thought, it cut cleanly to the center of whatever we were circling, like he was less interested in comfort than clarity. I learned small truths about them, where they worked, how long they'd known each other, the quiet disagreements they never argued aloud. They learned about me in return. I told them about my job, my apartment, the shape of my days. I did not tell them about Daniel Carter at first. When his name finally surfaced, it did so cautiously, like a fragile object placed between us. My boyfriend, I said, as if the word required explanation. Lucas nodded, unbothered. Ryan's gaze sharpened, just for a moment. Are you happy? Ryan asked. It wasn't an accusation. That was what unsettled me most. I don't know, I answered, and felt the honesty ripple outward, changing the air. Lucas didn't press. He only said, not knowing is still an answer. At home, Daniel noticed the distance before I did. He asked how my walks were going, if the fresh air was helping. I smiled and said yes. I kissed him with the same care I always had, but something in me remained elsewhere, measuring time in hours until the next clearing, the next conversation. The first lie came easily. The second followed faster. I stopped checking my phone when it buzzed in the forest. I told myself it was rude to interrupt a conversation, that I deserved a few hours without obligation. When Daniel asked if I wanted to cook together, I said I was tired. When he suggested a movie, I claimed a headache. None of it felt like betrayal in the moment. It felt like preservation. Lucas seemed to understand the unspoken boundary I kept drawing and redrawing. He never touched me. He never asked me to choose. Instead, he spoke about loneliness as if it were a language he'd studied for years. He talked about the cost of staying silent, about the danger of living a life that fit too neatly. Ryan was less patient with my justifications. You're already changing things, he said one afternoon, his voice low. Pretending otherwise doesn't protect anyone. I bristled, then deflated. I'm just talking, I said. Lucas glanced at Ryan, then back at me. Talking can still matter. That night, Daniel reached for me in bed, his hand warm and familiar. I froze for a fraction of a second before responding, and the hesitation felt louder than any refusal. He didn't mention it, but I sensed the question forming behind his eyes. Guilt settled into me, heavy and dull, followed closely by a dangerous relief that he hadn't asked. The next day in the forest, the air felt charged, as if the place itself recognized the tension I carried. Lucas spoke less. Ryan watched me more closely. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said suddenly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. No one ever does, Lucas replied. That doesn't mean no one does. Silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but full. I realized then that the line I feared crossing wasn't physical. It was the moment I began bringing my secrets here instead of home. The moment I started weighing my words with Daniel while offering them freely to two men who owed me nothing. When my phone buzzed again, I checked it this time. Daniel had sent a simple message, "Are you coming back soon?" I typed a response, erased it, and typed another. "Soon," I sent finally. Lucas didn't look at the screen. He looked at my face. "You don't have to decide everything today," he said. "But you should notice what you're already choosing." As I left the clearing, the path back felt longer, darker. I knew I hadn't crossed the line everyone warned about. Not yet. But I also knew something quieter and more dangerous had already begun, and it was only a matter of time before it demanded a decision. The tension followed me everywhere after that, clinging like a second shadow. At home, Daniel Carter moved with a carefulness that felt new, as if he were navigating a room filled with fragile objects. He asked fewer questions, but each glance lingered longer, searching my face for something I no longer knew how to offer. His silence hurt more than confrontation would have. In the forest, silence meant something else entirely. Lucas Hale and Ryan Moore noticed the shift in me before I spoke. I arrived distracted, my words scattered, my attention divided between the clearing and the phone vibrating in my pocket. Lucas watched with quiet patience, but Ryan's restraint thinned. "You're carrying this like it belongs to all of us," Ryan said, his voice even but firm. "It doesn't." I flinched. "I didn't ask you to carry it." "No," Ryan replied. "But you brought it here." Lucas stepped in then, not to interrupt but to steady the moment. "Ryan's not wrong," he said gently. "And neither are you. This is what happens when honesty waits too long." The truth of that settled heavily. I had told myself that as long as nothing physical happened, I was still faithful. but the definition had grown slippery, stretched thin by convenience. I thought of Daniel's unanswered questions, the messages left vague, the parts of myself I now reserved for this clearing instead of our shared kitchen table. Later that evening, Daniel finally spoke. "Are you seeing someone?" he asked, not accusing, just tired. The question knocked the air from my lungs. "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "Of course not." He nodded, but the relief I expected never came. Instead, his shoulders sagged, as if the answer confirmed something he'd already accepted. "I don't recognize you lately, Ethan," he said softly. "And I don't know how to reach you." I wanted to tell him everything then. The forest, Lucas, Ryan, the way I felt both understood and exposed. But fear held my tongue, not fear of losing him, but fear of being seen too clearly. So I apologized without explaining, promised effort without specifics, and watched the distance between us harden into something real. The next day, the forest felt smaller. Ryan arrived late, his jaw set, his words measured. "You can't keep doing this," he said once Lucas stepped away. "You're not trapped, Ethan. You're avoiding a decision." "I'm trying not to hurt anyone," I insisted. Ryan met my gaze steadily. "You already are. You're just choosing who feels it first." Lucas returned before I could respond. He sensed the fracture immediately. "We don't have to push this," he said to me. "You can walk away." I searched his face for persuasion and found none. That absence was more unsettling than pressure would have been. "And if I don't?" I asked. Lucas exhaled slowly. "Then you need to understand what you're choosing. Not just what you're escaping." The words echoed long after Ryan left us alone. The moment itself was quiet, almost ordinary. No dramatic declarations, no urgency. Just proximity, awareness, and a mutual recognition of what was about to change. When Lucas reached out, it wasn't sudden. It was deliberate, giving me every chance to stop him, to stop myself. I didn't. Crossing that line felt both electric and hollow, like stepping into a room I'd imagined too often. The thrill lasted only seconds before guilt rushed in to claim the space it left behind. I pulled back first, breath uneven, the weight of what I'd done settling sharply. "This doesn't fix anything," I said, more to myself than to Lucas. He nodded. "I know." I left the forest in a hurry, my thoughts unraveling faster than I could catch them. My phone buzzed again and again, messages stacking up unanswered. By the time I reached the road, there was a voicemail from Daniel, short, restrained, unmistakably final in tone. "I know something's wrong," his voice said. "And if you can't talk to me tonight, then we need to talk tomorrow. I can't keep guessing." I stood there, listening to the message twice, then a third time. The choice I'd avoided had finally arrived, stripped of excuses. Behind me, the forest remained silent, offering no guidance, only the memory of how easily I'd let myself drift away from the life I claimed to value. I turned toward home, knowing that whatever waited there, I would no longer be able to pretend I hadn't already chosen. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified, the refrigerator's hum, the distant traffic, the slow rhythm of Daniel Carter's breathing beside me. He lay turned away, his back a quiet barrier I hadn't noticed forming until it was already there. Morning arrived without relief, pale and indifferent, forcing the moment I had postponed into the open. We sat at the small kitchen table with untouched coffee cooling between us. Daniel spoke first, not because he was ready, but because silence had become unbearable. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Whatever it is, just don't make me guess anymore." I looked at him then, really looked. The familiarity of his face hurt more than anger would have. I didn't confess everything. I didn't know how to. But I told him enough, the forest, the meetings, the distance I created and failed to explain. I didn't excuse myself. I didn't ask for forgiveness. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression steady in a way that felt practiced. When I finished, he nodded once. "So you were already gone," he said quietly. "You just hadn't packed yet." The accuracy of that sentence stunned me. I reached for his hand, then stopped myself. Some gestures arrived too late to mean what they once did. Daniel stood, pushing his chair back gently, as if even anger required care. "I need space," he said. "Not to punish you, to remember who I am without this." I watched him gather a few things, his movements controlled, deliberate. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt cavernous, stripped of warmth and routine. I sat alone, finally facing the consequence I'd managed to avoid until now. I didn't return to the forest that day. Or the next. When I did go back, the clearing was empty. The absence of Lucas Hale and Ryan Moore felt intentional, like a boundary they had chosen not to cross again. I stood where we'd always talked, replaying words that now felt heavier in memory than they had in the moment. Ryan's voice echoed most clearly. "You're not trapped. You're avoiding a decision." Lucas had offered understanding, not rescue. I realized then that neither of them had promised me anything beyond honesty, and I had mistaken that for escape. I sat on a fallen log and let the quiet settle. Without the tension, the forest felt different, less charged, more ordinary. It struck me that I'd used this place the same way I'd used silence at home, as a shield against accountability. Days passed. Daniel didn't call. I didn't push. The distance we created was now doing its work, reshaping us separately. I thought about reaching out to Lucas, to explain, to ask what any of it had meant. But that urge faded when I recognized it for what it was, another attempt to avoid sitting fully inside my own choices. I wasn't proud of what I'd done. But I also wasn't willing to reduce it to a single mistake. Infidelity hadn't begun with the forest, and it hadn't ended there either. It had grown quietly, fed by my reluctance to speak honestly when it mattered most. One evening, as the light thinned and shadows stretched across the clearing, I stood and turned back toward the trail. I didn't know what waited ahead, whether Daniel would ever want to talk again, whether I would learn to choose differently next time. But I understood something I hadn't before. Desire doesn't destroy relationships on its own. Silence does. I left the forest without looking back, carrying no illusions with me this time.
The path forward wasn't redemptive or romantic. It was simply mine to walk, stripped of excuses, shaped by consequence, and finally, unmistakably clear. And for the first time since this began, that clarity felt like a beginning rather than an ending.